From FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and it has been a little more than a week since New York State adopted a $175.5 billion budget for fiscal 2020. The Empire Center says it's equivalent to $14.6 billion of spending per month. It's the kind of spending that raises a lot of questions, like how will that spending benefit upstate New York? And since those funds are raised through tax collection, what kind of impact will that have? My guest this hour is Michael Kracker, Executive Director of Unshackle Upstate, the advocacy coalition made up of business and trade organizations from across upstate New York. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be here.
So, first things first, tell us a little bit about Unshackle Upstate and what the kind of work you guys do sort of year-round.
Yeah, sure. Unshackle Upstate is, as you mentioned, a coalition of upstate chambers of commerce and statewide trade groups representing the interests of employers and taxpayers based in upstate New York. So I spent a lot of time around upstate and in the state capitol trying to elevate the issues that matter to upstate New Yorkers and make sure that we have a voice in a state capitol that's largely dominated by New York City interests. I think we all appreciate in New York State that upstate-downstate divide. And my efforts every day are to advocate for policies that will make upstate New York a better place to live and an easier place to do business. Something you know is not very easy today.
It's tough, for sure. So what are before we get into kind of some of the things that could help upstate get better, and I want to focus on that as we get through this 30, 40-minute conversation, what are the real-life implications of a $175 billion spending plan for New York State from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I think it starts with, happy spring. No season in New York starts without legislators being up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, passing a state budget, $175.5 billion of state spending passed in the late hours or early hours of April 1st. That is a tradition in New York unlike any other. But, there are some positives in the state budget, certainly for upstate New York taxpayers. The passage of a permanent 2% property tax cap. The governor had made that a significant priority. He had advanced that back in 2012, something we had long been calling for as an organization, and it had been extended several times. This budget actually makes that permanent without any provisions attached to it that water it down. And while the tax cap does get some criticism because it doesn't actually reduce spending, it has saved taxpayers $25 billion since 2012. That's real money. And now I think efforts need to focus on the mandate relief. You hear folks talk that when this was passed, the cap was part one and part two was mandate relief. Well, we've never gotten part two. So now I think our attention really needs to turn to that so we can actually start to reduce property taxes for New Yorkers. But that was a big win. But there were other things in the budget that were not good. There was billions of dollars in new revenue actions, what Albany likes to call taxes, whether it was the repeal of the energy service company sales tax exemption, which means businesses, and particularly in upstate, are going to be paying more in their utility bills, DOT right-of-way fee that's going to increase taxes on broadband deployment. Little things like that are, maybe hard for the general public to be paying attention to, but are going to have a pretty significant impact on their lives.
Now, you mentioned the property tax cap, and I want to talk about that because when you talk to elected officials, especially in rural communities, like you said, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some are in favor of it, others are saying, yeah, but if mandates aren't cut back, then it's effectively a wash for us. As far as growth goes, or as far as being able for these smaller communities to be able to do a little more with a little less, how much mandate relief is really necessary to make that property tax cap feel like a real win? Because it may not feel like that right now, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mandate relief, I'm sure, that can be achieved. Albany loves to pass unfunded mandates onto municipalities, and it's things you wouldn't necessarily expect, even with the increasing of your voting hours. Now, for primary states, or every county is going to have to be open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Previously, counties could be open at noon to 9. Well, there's a cost associated with that, and Albany mandates that they do this, but they don't necessarily provide the funding necessary for municipalities to be able to make up that cash gap. You've heard a lot of talk of late about the state absorbing the full cost of Medicaid. And frankly, if that were to happen, a lot of municipalities would be able to almost virtually abolish their property taxes. So there's a ton that can be done, but I think now that the tax cap is permanent, I think it's incumbent upon Albany to really take this seriously and find ways to start unburdening local municipalities of some of the mandates that they've pushed on them so that we can actually start to reduce property taxes, which would make a huge difference. We have some of the highest property taxes as a percentage of home value here in upstate New York. Broome County, I think, actually leads the nation in that space, which isn't really a distinction anybody wants, but they have it. So it's a problem we have to address because it's an impediment for families that live here, and it's a deterrent for people wanting to relocate here.
What are I'm sure you talk to a lot of folks who own businesses, who work in these small businesses and sort of own these properties that are highly taxed. What are some of the things that you hear from those folks in terms of what they want you to fight for, or what changes they'd like to see that might help them out a little?
I think when we think about what's a challenge to businesses, particularly small businesses, our first instinct is to look at the tax structure, and that's a problem, no question. We should be looking for ways to reduce our tax burden. But the other side of it is the regulatory burden. We have a very, very complicated regulatory burden, and it's little things that Albany thinks don't make a big difference, but when you stack them all on top of each other, for a small business in particular, they're things that are very difficult to comply with. Something as innocent as sexual harassment training mandates. Well, there's a cost associated with that, and there's a burden and there's a penalty. So, employers, when you add that on top of everything, this new state budget requires 3 hours of PTO, paid time off, for employees to go vote on election day, whether they need it or not. They may have a shift that allows them to go vote, but they can take it without having to prove. And that's a small thing, but there is a cost associated with that. So Albany, I think, very often thinks that the impacts of their regulatory burden are minor, but when you stack them all up, it really adds up for a small business in particular who doesn't necessarily have the resources or the staff or anything like that to comply. So a lot of times it's something that feels innocent, but has a real impact.
And curious if you agree with this. Assembly Minority Leader Brian Kolb was in last week, and he essentially said there's a lack of planning when it comes to the current administration in terms of these regulations, such as minimum wage, things like that, not thinking what the impact's going to be, not just this year or next year, but 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now.
Yeah, I certainly think that sometimes, very often, Albany fails to comprehend the unintended consequences of their actions. And something may feel good and sound, like it is going to be a benefit. It looks good on paper and makes for a good press release. But then there's what happens 2, 3, 4, 10 years down the road. We may get into it in more detail, but right now Albany is considering this Farm Fair Labor Act, which would mandate overtime and some other employee benefits on your agriculture industry. And, if you're applying a 40-hour work week mandate on a farm when our growing season is, maybe 4 months of the year, you've got to cram a whole year's worth of business into a few months. You're not going to be able to work 9 to 5. You got to be up dusk till dawn. I mean, that's sort of the opinion everybody has of agriculture. It's really hard work. You're working long hours, but you got a short season here in New York. So here Albany is really coming out of New York City, which I think is ironic that New York City would be trying to mandate the agriculture industry, because I'm not aware of any, farms of any significance in Manhattan. But there's a significant unintended consequence, and we're already losing a lot of farms here in New York. 2,100 since 2012 have closed. So if we're going to go ahead and add this mandate on top of it, how many more are going to close? Mm-hmm. And here's something I think where people feel like they're making a decision that's in the best interest of New York, and at the end of the day, it'll have the opposite effect.
And a lot of those farms, as we've seen in some of the numbers, are family-owned
mm-hmm.
farms. They're the small operations, not the large ones. Is that one of the concerns when you start to see an eroding of sort of family-owned businesses, small businesses in upstate New York?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, on these regulatory burdens, a lot of times a larger business might be able to
they can eat it.
Make it work. If you've got a mandate on employers, your Home Depots of the world might be able to survive, but your local hardware store might say, this is making it too expensive for me to continue to operate. And that's not to say that these challenges don't also negatively impact your larger businesses, but it's really the family-owned businesses, the smaller operations that are also the lifeblood of the upstate New York economy. Whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or your shops up and down Main Street, that's who are the employers in upstate New York. We don't have that many large employers. You don't have your Buffalo Bethlehem Steels or your Kodaks in Rochester. Those aren't operating any longer. It's really our economy now is diverse. It's mostly small or micro-sized businesses, and those are the businesses that really feel the pinch when Albany comes knocking at the door for their tax revenues and adding additional regulatory burden.
Curious, what did you make of the debate around prevailing wage that seemed to really heat up over the last 30 days or so before budget was signed?
Yeah, that was one where a lot of us were hitting the refresh page trying to find out if it was going to be in or was going to be out. And I believe that this is an existential issue for upstate economic development. For those who aren't familiar with the issue, a prevailing wage mandate, right now we have a prevailing wage on public works. And public works are defined really as public infrastructure projects, your schools, your roads, your hospitals, your public hospitals, jails, things like that are public works projects. And as such, they're required to pay a prevailing wage, which is essentially a negotiated union wage and union benefits. What some in Albany are attempting to do is to expand the definition of public works to require prevailing wage on projects who receive even a single dollar of public subsidy. So, the sad reality is in New York, not much economic development takes place, particularly upstate, without some form of public inducement. That's, your IDA or economic development loans, that's SBA grants, historic tax credits, brownfield remediation, programs like that are designed to say, listen, it's pretty expensive to do business in New York. We have some of the highest construction costs in the country. So the public's going to incentivize a project to help generate economic development. Well, now if you're requiring those businesses to pay, those developers to pay significantly higher wages and benefits, as many as might increase the project costs as much as 35%, they might not be as attractive for a developer to pursue. I heard somebody say the private sector is smart. They're not going to give $6 to get $2 back. That's a pretty poor business model. Mm-hmm. So they may just say, you know what, we can build elsewhere. We don't need to build in New York. And unfortunately, we're already lagging behind New York City here with economic development. There's explosive growth down in the 5 boroughs, not so much, here in Seneca Falls or other places. So if we're putting wet blankets on our economic development, we're going to see less construction and less jobs, period.
And doesn't that also kind of breed a scenario where you could just see as a result higher figures going out in terms of public inducement, just the tax breaks, et cetera, growing to compensate?
Well, there was sort of some talk about, well, what about if we increase the public inducement to offset the wages? Well, now all you're really doing is you're asking the taxpayers to subsidize union wages further, and I don't think that's a fair thing to ask. Some of these public inducements already get a fair share of criticism. If now you're just increasing them and making the taxpayers pay that burden, so that you can basically pay a union wage, and most of those times you're going to end up with union labor, that's a problem. You also create barriers for entry when you do this to smaller mom-and-pop operations. Your well-financed groups can probably manage to pay that increased wage. A smaller operation might say, this project's too expensive for me to bid on. I'm going to have to take a pass. I can't afford to pay those wages, and I'm going to leave it to the bigger guys. So again, the smaller sized businesses lose out, and ultimately, in some shape or form, the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for it, and it's going to be a real shame.
And it seems interesting because a lot of times when we get into these types of discussions or these types of policies, you're ended up talking about moving money from one column and putting it in another column, or moving spending from one column and just moving it to another. And the real benefit seems to be the press side of it for the administration, the Albany in general, those political groups who feel favorably about these different pieces of legislation. What is that element? Like, why aren't we seeing more sizable real change if these policies are so great? Yeah,
that's really it. I sometimes question the logic behind pushing this proposal. Some of the labor unions will say, well, we're going to be paying people more on these jobs. Well, my assertion is you're not, what's a 30% increase on zero construction? Zero. If the projects aren't happening, nobody's getting paid. whether you're willing to pay them more or not. And I do also look at it from the governor's perspective. I think everybody knows the governor likes to cut ribbons and announce big projects. Well, if you're making these projects 25, 30% more expensive, there's going to be significantly less of them. So I don't know, politicians like to go around and pull out the big scissors and cut a ribbon on a project or put the shovel in the ground. If there's no developers who want to pursue these projects, you're not going to see it. So I don't really understand the desire for this. We have a definition of public works, and it's been something that's existed in the state for a long time. Applying it to private development, I think, is irresponsible and will ultimately lead to less construction in upstate New York. New York City, they've got the critical mass of development that they might be able to do it. We just simply don't have that kind of development here and that demand to build. If you're going to put another roadblock in front of it, you're going to halt development.
And minimum wage, obviously, starting to get to its apex here in the Finger Lakes and in upstate New York. Walk us through what the real-life implications of that have been over the last 2-3 years as the updates to minimum wage have occurred.
Yeah, I think backing up, it was an example of New York State recognizing that we have different economies in downstate and upstate. And when ultimately there was a compromise on minimum wage, it was stated that New York City will rise at a faster rate than upstate New York, and that upstate will go to, I think the final number is $12.50 next year. And then the Department of Labor will somehow calculate what further increases are going to be, and that's going to be a whole other can of worms when we get there. But I think you are starting to see the pinch. You're starting to see, again, particularly some of your smaller businesses that are saying, now that this is increasing year after year, we're starting to feel the pressure, and we're starting to get to that point where, either we're reducing the amount of employees we have or looking for ways to reduce our labor costs. I think I saw a statistic that New York City had the slowest growth in the restaurant industry that it's had in years. And a lot of the folks are attributing that to the increases in minimum wage. And then, it's not an uncommon sight for you to go into a restaurant and find a kiosk instead of an employee greeting you. That is a way that businesses who, at the end of the day are in it to make a profit are saying, how do I cut my costs? And as you increase the labor costs, that's going to become a much more attractive column to seek to make reductions. And I think you're going to continue to see it as that cost goes up.
So one of the things that always gets discussed and talked about, infrastructure spending, how do we sort of fix the issues in upstate, rural upstate? From your point of view, what are some of the things that Albany could do to sort of help this, easing some of the mandates maybe, but in general, what kind of plan does Albany need to put together to make this work? Well,
I do think there needs to be an acknowledgement, certainly, that upstate infrastructure needs are as important as downstate. In this budget process, you heard a lot about the MTA, and no doubt the MTA has their problems. I'm not asking for them not to focus on trying to make the New York City subway system, which has, millions of travelers or whatever the number is. It's very, very, very popular. But that shouldn't come at the expense of our upstate infrastructure needs, particularly in rural communities. We all know it. Some of our roads and bridges are completely defunct, and sometimes you've got bridges that are in the ground and are closed. And that's just on your roads and bridges. You've also got sewer infrastructure needs. You've got, upstate transit infrastructure needs. And I don't think that Albany this year put much of an emphasis on that. And I think going forward, that's going to be something we're looking at very intently. We're in the process now kind of working through a deep dive on some of the numbers to see how much we lost out on. You've heard some of the Republicans, particularly upstate, sort of lament the elimination of extreme weatherization dollars and a reduction in CHIPS funding, and that's a concern. If we get to a point where Albany is no longer paying attention to upstate infrastructure, that's going to be very telling. During this change in the Senate majority, we were told, you've got nothing to worry about. We're going to make sure we're doing the same to focus on upstate New York. The Senate Republicans had long lamented a change in party would mean a change in focus. Part of my job is to make sure that we're holding them accountable to that commitment to continuing to fight for upstate New York. And I think we'll sort of see where this goes. But no doubt this budget put a much greater emphasis on the MTA, and I have a concern if that continues to be the trend going forward, because we have real needs. And there are things we could do to reduce the costs. Reforming the New York State scaffold law is something that we could do that would make our infrastructure dollars go a lot further. Certainly, Prevailing wage would have an impact on that. So there's certainly concerns, but no doubt Albany needs to do more to focus on our roads and bridges and sewer infrastructure and other things like that.
It's interesting because when we talk to some elected officials in here, on both sides of the aisle, sometimes there's an admission and a little bit of a resignation, I guess, to the fact that it doesn't really feel like Albany cares that much about those infrastructure needs here in the Finger Lakes or in these rural communities. And to that end, you mentioned the property tax cap earlier. Sometimes it even comes up where they will say we may have to exceed the tax cap at some point and do this ourselves. At what point do you think these communities get to that point where they say Albany just isn't going to do it for us, we're going to have to do it ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of been a mentality. You know, I think the Siena poll that came out recently kind of indicated that a lot of folks in upstate New York don't feel that Albany's got their interests at heart, and I think municipalities sort of feel that too. And I think it's incumbent upon everybody to say that loudly and speak up and try to put pressure on Albany to address these issues. Certainly, sort of taking charge and moving forward on their own is an option, and there is a mechanism for them to override the cap. And I think when that happens, Albany's got to take notice. But it's a challenge. We got to make sure that we're holding our elected officials responsible at all levels, whether it's the governor or the legislature as a whole. Certainly, I know your local legislator may be championing for you, but if they're not in the room where the pie is getting divided, that may not be all that impactful, but certainly they can still raise the issue and work with their colleagues, and that's part of our role too, is to make sure that we're holding people accountable when they're not delivering for upstate New York.
What are you hearing? We talked a little bit about infrastructure. What are you hearing in terms of broadband expansion? That seems to be, when we talk to the local leaders, that's the area that they're really starting to focus on now, not just roads, bridges, and water and sewer, but making sure that broadband access is legitimate across the board.
It's 2019. This is as important as any other part of infrastructure. And the state has sort of declared victory on this, but I think in rural America, rural upstate New York, we know that that's not the case. You've heard they said they've basically covered 99% of the state or something like that. But you go into a lot of these rural communities, and they don't have access to high-speed broadband. And whether it's your kids going to school and having to come home and do projects, or just basically being a New Yorker in 2019, where everything revolves around the internet. That's a significant disadvantage for people who don't have access. I think the state's doing some things to address that. I know that there have been some challenges with companies like Spectrum, and the rollout's not been perfect. But I also think things like this DOT broadband fee are going to slow the ability to roll that out, and it's going to decrease the private sector's incentive to want to pursue this. But no question, having access to the latest 21st century broadband technology is critical for us to be attractive places for existing residents and a desirable place for new residents to want to locate. So it all fits in together, but no doubt the state's got to do more.
And obviously plastic bags and perhaps styrofoam is next. It seems to be this sort of trend moving forward. Your feelings and what you've sort of seen, how this has been played out over the last 2 months, which for a lot of people feels rushed. It feels quick.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's a significant change. I thought that there was maybe some opportunity for them to phase in some of these changes over a longer stream and allow some of these businesses to do sort of an education campaign with their customers. No doubt the ban on plastic bags, I think, is going to be a big change for people. And it's also going to be a little bit of a burden on some employers, whether it's your small convenience stores or things like that. Paper is a more expensive product, so now they have to purchase that or have their customers utilize their own bag. And there's going to be also, I think, maybe a little bit of a burden dealing with the fact that the stores, the clerks are going to be the ones that are sort of bearing the brunt of this. No one's going to, when somebody comes in to buy their groceries and they're kind of angry that they can't get a plastic bag, they're not going to take it out on their legislator. They're going to take it out on the, poor kid at the Wegmans line, and he's going to hear from it. But there's also, I think, just this movement in Albany to ban products without fully taking into account the science behind it. You mentioned the styrofoam or polystyrene. First of all, there's real jobs here in the Finger Lakes that make these products. I was in Albany last week with the plastics industry talking about this issue, and you've got two companies in the Canandaigua area, in Pactiv and what used to be Commodore Plastics. I'm not sure of the name now, but they're real jobs. I think Pactiv's got 700 employees. In Bloomfield, there's, I think, 180 employees that are making this product. And I think for Ontario County, those are big employers. I think Pactiv's the second largest private employer in the county. If you ban these products, a lot of those people are going to be struggling for work. And to what end are you banning them? Is the alternative actually any better? I would make the case it is not. I think this is something that Albany needs to really slow down on and look at the science and understand what not only the impact is on the employees that are making these products here in New York, but what actual impact is this going to have on pollution and on our landfills, and are these products that they're replacing it with any safer? Because they're certainly more expensive. Right. So I think, again, this gets back to the unintended consequences, and is Albany really thinking all of these things through?
And when you talk to a lot of, when we talk to a lot of employers, small and big, up here in the Finger Lakes, workforce development seems to be the big concern, not having that prospective employee pool to pull from. Is that something that you hear across upstate New York?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the unsung issues that is a challenge to employers is workforce and finding that next generation of workers with a particular skill. I think if you go to any machine shop, any construction site, really, anything in the manufacturing space in particular, and you walk the floor, you're going to see a lot of gray hair. And that's no criticism to those folks, but as they near retirement age, you're not seeing the backflow of young talent coming in and having the skills necessary to do the jobs that are required. So I think that's something that Albany should use as an opportunity to work with the business community. I think it's a mutually beneficial exercise. You've got, people need good-paying jobs. These jobs are available, and they're looking for talent. But the state should step in and help provide, some support for these people to get the skills that are necessary to then enter the workforce. It keeps them off of, some of the public assistance programs and provides them, good employment opportunities, and it gives, our existing employers that next generation of talent that they so desperately desire. It's one of the biggest concerns, I think, of the business community is, making sure you've got talent to replace that retiring generation.
So one of the questions that popped up on social media when we were previewing this conversation was, how long before New York State moves toward or moves into a single-payer healthcare system? A lot of folks, it seems like when you talk to a lot of folks, it feels imminent. It feels like it is something that's going to happen eventually if the political tides don't change.
Yeah, I certainly have my concerns about that. I think what I've tried to do is talk about, there's two differences. There's achieving universal coverage, which I think is a goal that everybody supports and one that I think is worthwhile to pursue, and single payer. And single payer means everybody is covered under a state-sponsored healthcare plan, and you basically are outlining private insurance and mandating that everybody go into essentially a state-managed Medicaid program. And I think that's the difference that I think people don't appreciate when they think single payer. They just think, sure, everybody should have access to insurance, and I would agree with that. But a state-managed, $200 billion healthcare plan that outlaws private insurance and closes all the existing insurance companies, which is maybe 50,000 jobs that are gone overnight, is something that I think should be concerning for people. There are, in the governor's initial budget proposal, he had wanted to create this universal coverage commission that would look at ways that the private sector and the public sector can work together to provide universal coverage. And we were very supportive of that. I think that's something that should be pursued. I don't think the state should pursue a single-payer healthcare system. It's failed in most places that you've tried to do it at the state level. And I know there's also talk about perhaps the federal government at some point pursuing that. I don't think anybody would expect that to happen under the current administration, but it may be something that gets looked at sometime down the road. But I just think at this point, you're going to double the size of the state budget. You're going to massively raise taxes on everybody across the board, and you're going to put a lot of people out of work to achieve a solution to a problem that's really affecting about 5% of the state's population. That's the population percentage of current uninsured individuals. And I think that there are more effective, more affordable ways to address closing that coverage gap than a single-payer healthcare system.
So over the next year, as you guys look forward and start to work through your plan for 2019 and the beginning of 2020, getting into that budget process, what are some of the things that you focus on heading into the summer?
Yeah, I think, throughout the next couple of weeks, there's no question it's going to be playing a lot of defense. I think there's a lot of policy that's on the table before the end of June when the legislature breaks for session that we have concerns about. The proposals about the Climate Community Protection Act or the Green New Deal, elimination of the tipped wage credit, expansion of rent regulations in upstate New York. There's a lot of things that we're going to be working to sort of pump the brakes on. But I think going forward, we're going to try to spend, the summer months reaching out to legislators, particularly in upstate New York, to try to find some common ground that we can achieve some victories that will make upstate New York a better place to do business. And I think there are issues that we would agree on that we want to try to find opportunities to work with, members of the Democratic Party to say, you guys are in the majority. Let's try to find ways that we can work together to make New York State a better place to do business. There's a manufacturing bill that was actually carried for a number of years by Senator Tom O'Mara that is now being carried by Senator Anna Kaplan that would bring the manufacturing tax rates down to zero for all manufacturers. Right now, some of the larger manufacturers are paying a 0% tax rate. This would expand it to your smaller manufacturers, and that would make, I think, New York State a very attractive place for your small manufacturers to do business. And that's something that we can do that has minimal impact on state revenue, but will have a tremendous impact on the business climate here in New York for manufacturers. So trying to identify things like that ultimately make upstate New York a more affordable place to live and do business is something that we're going to be looking to find partnerships on going forward.
And to that end, when we sort of see the reports come out, it feels like every couple of months that upstate New York is losing population and maybe upstate should break away from downstate, all of these really sort of big trends, and they turn into these really big discussions. When you guys hear them, do you sort of back that down a little bit and say there is a reasonable option on the table here if we just work together? Yeah,
I always say I share the frustration that generates those bills to separate New York into whether 3 autonomous regions or into 2 states or anything like that. There are a couple different proposals out there. I understand the frustration that creates that mentality. I think that our role at Unshackle Upstate is to elevate the issues that matter to upstate New York and try to force them into the discussion under the current structure. I also think there are probably some significant hurdles to achieving those proposals, actually having those become reality. There's not only a challenge at getting them through the state level, but then the federal government also has to weigh in on that, and I don't know that that's likely to happen. So I think our time is better spent trying to advance issues that we feel will make upstate New York a better place to live and do business, and working under the existing structure, and really just trying to find that common ground to say, listen, we got to start with acknowledging we have a problem here. Mm-hmm. Our population is shrinking significantly. There are some pockets of success, but holistically, there's no question we have a problem. What can we do in Albany to address those problems?
All right, Michael, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Josh, good to be with you.